Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back into the studio. Today's mission is a good one and a difficult one. We need to decide how this mold is going to eventually be opened. The reason we need to decide now is because before we make the mother mold on top of the silicone, we need to make silicone walls that we are going to cut through the middle of to make sure the silicone can come off our sculpture. Once the walls are built, we will use these walls as natural borders for where our plaster mother mold will separate. So, let's get to it. At this moment, I'm going to decide on how many pieces of silicone I'm going to need to take this mold apart once it's done. Not only that, I'm going to decide how many pieces of mother mold I will need on top of my silicone to ensure that it comes off as well. The silicone is flexible, so a lot of the restrictions on where you place your silicone wall actually comes down to how and if your mother mold is going to come off. The general rule of thumb that I go by here is that from one chosen viewpoint, one chosen perspective, I must place my silicone wall along the horizon of my piece. In other words, right on the high point where the form of my sculpture disappears from my view. Imagine that you have a hard sphere and two hollow pieces meant to cover the sphere. These two pieces meant to cover the sphere needs to be separated right at the high point of the sphere, right in the middle, the widest point, otherwise they will lock onto the sphere and never comes off. However, there are some modifiers that change things, of course. There always are. One of these modifiers is the source of my first decision, and my first decision is going to be to separate the upper and lower half of the mold. This accomplishes two things. Number one, it really eases casting and gives me easy access to the inside of the mold when the mold is closed. Number two, it means that I solve the issue of my plumber's piping support pole coming out of the sculpture's hip, getting stuck inside my mold. Of course, there are ways to release the pole without separating upper and lower half. It's not an unsolvable issue. However, by splitting the mold into upper and lower half, I solved this issue with very little hassle. So, two birds in one stone, which is always nice. As you can see, I use small clay pieces as placeholders for where I want my walls to eventually be. The reason I use clay pieces is because they can move if I need to. If I draw with a Sharpie marker, for example, I might very well make some mistakes. And it's much easier to move clay around than it is to wash off the Sharpie and remark it. With the decision made about separating into upper and lower half, it's time to decide how to separate the upper and lower half again into two separate pieces. I prefer two pieces as two pieces come back together really easily. So as a general rule of thumb, I would always encourage you to separate your silicone skins into two halves, two pieces. The mother mold can be more pieces, but two halves for the silicone skin is a good rule of thumb. By looking directly at the front of the torso and placing the wall where the front and the back of the upper body meet, I will end up with a less deep and more broad piece of silicone. And this is always preferable to a deep and narrow piece of silicone, which will have a much harder time coming off your sculpture. I have to consider the seam lines too. Where is the seam line on my eventual casting going to be? A bad idea would be to have the seam line go straight through the face, so I place it to the side of the face, which further exacerbates another issue. The head is turned, and what this means is that I either have to turn the entire wall to face the front of the face, which I've already explained I don't want to do because of the seam line. Silicone is flexible, so I'm really only limited here by the mother mold. But unlike the silicone, the mother mold can easily be made out of several smaller pieces bolted together. So instead of having two halves, I can have one half with two pieces of mother mold. So in this scenario, I make the decision to keep my silicone wall where I originally wanted it and to separate the upper front half of the mother mold into two pieces. Notice in the video that I constantly step away from my piece. I do that in order to check from a distance that I can see every piece of clay that I've placed. If one piece of clay disappears from view, it means that I've placed it over the horizon of my sculpture, and I need to move it slightly forward. I use this technique to make sure that I can see all the pieces of clay from both the front and the back. And if I can see the pieces of clay from the front and the back, the placement of my wall will be sound and the model mold shell will come off. As long as there are no undercuts on the surface of the piece, that is. An undercut is an area inside the piece that disappears from view, like behind the fold or something like that. And this is a high risk area where you are very likely to have the mold get stuck. Now, luckily for me, I don't have any of those right here. And eventually, in another video, I'll show you how to deal with those when I have a piece that actually has some undercuts. After all of that, I replace all the pieces of clay with Sharpie marks, which are a bit more permanent and doesn't fall off and doesn't get in the way when I start applying silicone to actually build a wall. Okay, with the upper half planned and dealt with, I need to plan and deal with the lower half. Because we separated the mold into upper and lower half, these two are completely independent of each other, and this is going to be of huge benefit to me because of the way the legs are positioned. One leg, the right leg, is bent, and because of this, from the front view that we used for our torso, it sits in front of the left leg. Which means that if I use the front of the torso as the front of the legs, the model mold won't come off because one leg is going to be trapped behind the other leg. Meaning that as I'll take it off, it'll hit the other leg. It'll get stuck behind it essentially. So my solution to this problem is simple. Rotate what I consider as the front of the leg towards the 3/4 view until the left leg no longer is covered by the right. It's a very simple solution and one that I can use simply because I have separated the upper and lower half of the mold. Because we do have an opening between the legs, I'm going to need to build a wall there as well. And I'll try to place this wall right on the other side of the wall that's on the outside of the leg. Now I think a good way to visualize this is to imagine a clock. If the wall placed on the outside of the leg was at 12 o'clock, I want the wall on the inside of the leg to be placed at 6 o'clock. In order to open this mold eventually, we will have to cut this wall open after the outside wall has been cut and the clay and the armature of the leg has been removed. So we're probably going to have to cut this wall from the inside actually. This sculpture is pretty straightforward. Nothing is really complicated about any of this. Just make sure that when observed from a distance, the piece can come off directly at you. No part of the mold should be covered by another part in order for it to come off in painless fashion. That was all the heavy thinking we need to do in this episode. Now it's time to build the dam wall. And to make sure that the silicone will stick properly, I cleaned the sculpture of any dust and debris just using like a wet paper towel. Silicone tends to stick to itself, but there's no reason not to give it any help to make sure that it actually does. I'm going to be using the same silicone as I did before, so if you're interested in that, check out the previous video. But of course, we have some new twists in place. I'm using a faster setting catalyzer to speed up the process. I'm not covering a lot of area here, I'm not building a lot at the time, and if I have to sit and wait for a long time for silicone to set up, I'll get bored and it'll be a waste of time. So the fast catalyzer it is. The fast catalyzer that I use is pink, which is not universal for fast catalyzer, but simply a measure that the manufacturer uses to ensure that you can visually see the difference between the regular setting yellow catalyzer and the fast setting pink catalyzer. And it also kind of smells of strawberry, which is nice. The only real thing to pay close attention to while using fast catalyzer is that you don't want to over-catalyze using the fast catalyzer. If you do, the silicone becomes very dry and brittle and it will have a lot of trouble sticking to the old silicone that was already on the sculpture. So err on the side of caution when using it. Use a little bit less than you think is necessary. If you're curious about mixing the silicone and ratios of catalyzer to silicone, you can watch the previous video in this series. For the first pass, I'm interested in building up a triangle-shaped preform that I can expand upon in later passes. The size of this triangle is a bit based on taste and experience. I know and can kind of feel how much I can get away with while building this wall before it begins to sag. And if it sags, it can compromise the placement of my wall, of course, because the wall will move, and it will also slow down the curing process because the silicone is moving, which means I must wait longer for the next pass. Ultimately, this is fairly straightforward though. I take the silicone and pinch it using my thumbs to create a wedge. I do actually use quite a bit of force here because I don't want any air bubbles between the silicone wall and the silicone layers covering the sculpture. I also keep it fairly smooth and neat for no reason at all. Let's take a quick second to talk about how you can support the channel. Subscribing and liking the video is of great help, of course. If you would like to get something in return for your support, however, head over to my Patreon page. On Patreon, you can watch exclusive content like the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, which we just completed, and the Portrait series, which we just started, where I will show you everything you need to know about sculpting portraiture. You can also get personal feedback on your own work from me on anything you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So, check it out. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description below. On the second pass, I continue to use pink catalyzer, and this time I try to add a lot of material because we have some support to keep it from sagging in the form of the first pass, so I can do that. And this time I'm going for a rectangular shape, not a triangular one. This requires a slightly different technique. So instead of pinching with my thumbs, with my two thumbs, I pinch the material using my thumb and my middle finger when applying this pass, and I try to make sure that I have a fairly neat end result as well. Pretty close to the eventual size and shape of the wall that I'm after. However, this is not my beauty pass, so if something is not as nice as it perhaps could be, I'm not going to be overly concerned and worried about it. I'll deal with that, the beauty of it all, on the third pass. The third pass is the beauty pass. To give myself the best chance of making sure my wall is nice, square, and neat, I use yellow catalyzer for this step, so I have a little bit more time. It's going to set up slower and is more prone to sagging, of course, but the amount that I need to add now is a lot less than what I needed to add earlier, so sagging becomes a lot less of a concern, and I also have a lot of support. I'm after a completely smooth result here, one that has no lumps, no bumps, and one that is square with sharp 90-degree corners. The sharp corners and attention to detail is going to prolong the life of the mold because there will be no points where the silicone could snag and begin to rip. That's with the smoothness factor. And the square corners make sure that I will have no problem with the registration between the silicone and the mother mold. If you've done some mold making before, you might have noticed that there is very little in terms of registration on my silicone. The sharp turn from the silicone layers covering the sculpture to the silicone wall is going to be my registration. It's all that I'm going to need. So it needs to be good and it needs to be neat because it's going to be all the registration I have. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for that next week. If you want to support the channel, watch longer, more in-depth videos, or get feedback on your own work from me, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.